Ghost Love by Eileen Sheehan. Narrated by Ferdy Luthi. Copyright 2018, Eileen Sheehan. Notice, this is a thriller romance audiobook. It contains graphic and/or explicit scenes that may prove offensive to the sensitive listener. It is intended for mature listeners. Succubus, a demoness from hell whose sole purpose it is to drain the souls of men by having sex with them. Reference Urban Dictionary. Prologue. Spring 1889. "Miss Bellamy! Miss Bellamy!" the teenage boy called breathlessly as he raced up the hillside as fast as his long and lanky legs would let him. When he reached the top, he placed his hand on his thighs to support his torso as he focused on regulating his breathing. "Miss Bellamy," he swallowed hard while speaking, "your father is mighty angry to find you left the settlement once again. I fear you will not fare well if he discovers that you wandered this far away. Call me Lucille or Lucy, anything but Miss Bellamy. This is not the first time I have asked this of you, Charles." The young man's face reddened. "I will try to remember, Lucille." Lucy looked down upon the valley below her. Patches of green grass as far as the eye could see struggled against the melting snow as winter made way for spring. Off in the distance, the rugged mountains that had forced them to make camp during one of the harshest winters Montana Territory had seen 8 years earlier clung to the snow that they coveted year-round at their highest points. They had learned of a French settlement not far from Vancouver while booking passage west with a small wagon train, and grew excited, as did a few companion French families with every conversation that took place about it. After many long months of grueling travel across country, and the unimaginable hardships that came with it, including the death of her mother and younger brother, many settlers decided to put down roots in the valley they'd been forced to winter in when the thaw finally allowed them to travel on, her father being one of them. Using his business savvy, he quickly assessed that the best way to live a comfortable life in such a remote mountainside location was to own and operate a small trading post. Little by little the word spread. The little trading post was being well received by miners and loggers for miles around, who appreciated the convenience of not having to trek into Fort Benson for basic staples. It was already late April. Winter was quick to come and slow to leave in the valley nestled in the mountains, but that didn't stop the settlers from focusing on building a life for themselves. What proved to be a greater obstacle was the lack of law, unscrupulous men searching for gold, and the skirmishes between the Blackfoot and the Crow Indian tribes. Even so, Antoine Bellamy insisted that the young settlement of Muddy Creek in the Montana Territory was as good a place as any to live in such a savage land. He had often spoken of returning to their little country estate in France, but Lucy knew that it was simply talk. He thought it was a secret, but she'd known since the afternoon when they packed a few of their most precious belongings and secretly fled to the ship that brought them across the expansive ocean that they could never return. She had no idea what her father did, but he was running from the law for certain. Returning to France would mean his death. He knew it, and so did she. In fact, this great secret thing that he did was the reason they'd traveled to such an unsettled and uncivilized territory. Here, he was beyond the reach of the law. More than once, she'd let her imagination walk through her scenarios that would meet the criteria of such seriousness as to force them to flee. Thievery? Debts? Murder? Seeing the Statue of Liberty standing tall and proud as their ship made its way toward Ellis Island had been breathtaking. She was certain that she wouldn't see anything so majestic and grand for the rest of her life. But she was wrong. The scene before her as she stood on the flat-topped boulder, with the crisp mountain air making merry with her full head of long blonde hair, had to be just as grand and majestic, if not more so. "Lucille, please, I told your father that you went to the creek to see about catching some fish for supper. He's expecting me to return with you shortly." Lucy pulled the fur collar of her coat tighter around her neck, but not before a gust of cold wind managed to invade the warmth it provided and cause her body to shudder. "What will you say when we return with no fish and no fishing rod?" Charles grinned at his own cleverness. "Ah, but I have 4 fish keeping cold in the creek that I caught early this morning. My mother and I only need 2. I can give you 2 of them for your supper." Lucy smiled. "You are a clever boy." "I'm not a boy. I'm a man," he grumbled as he hopped off the boulder and started down the hill without waiting for her. At 17, Lucy was only 1 year older than Charles. It was true that she should no longer refer to him as a boy, but he was still a few years short of qualifying as a man. She sometimes felt sorry for him. He had lost his father and older brother on the trip west. He and his mother were all that was left to make up a family, and he was forced into the position of being the man of the family. The pressures of such a responsibility pushed him into wanting to become a real man and take on the responsibilities that went along with it, including marriage. While she longed to be a young girl again, he couldn't wait to become a man. Where circumstances had thrown Charles into the position of being the man of the family, they'd thrown Lucille into becoming the woman of hers. She found it to be tiresome and confining. Her father monitored her every move, for fear that some young buck would come along and steal her most precious commodity that was meant for the husband she questioned would ever come, her maidenhead. Without a female in the family to explain just exactly what a woman's maidenhead was and how it was stolen, Lucy was left to her own devices to figure it out. She had a feeling it was connected to that time of the month when she bled. Molly Ambers had been on hand for her to run to when the blasted bleeding started. She had assured Lucy that she was far from sick and was definitely not dying. She was simply becoming a woman. She called this time her menses, and said that most girls started their menses at a much younger age than Lucy, and she should be happy she was spared the years. Sadly, Molly passed away of consumption 2 winters ago, and since her father only recently started obsessing about her maidenhead, she hadn't a clue who to ask. There were other women in the settlement, but none she felt comfortable enough to discuss such a sensitive topic with. The responsibilities of the woman in the house fell on Lucy at the tender age of 14, so she really didn't realize the extent that her life would have been different had her mother lived. Although she didn't find caring for the house and tending to her father's needs to be burdensome, she had no desire to take on the role of wife of a new household. Things were running just fine as they were. She guessed that her father wasn't in a hurry to lose her any more than she was in a hurry to leave him. Otherwise, he wouldn't be so worried about her preserving her stupid maidenhead in a settlement that rarely saw an eligible, husband-worthy man pass through it. Charles was long gone before she forced herself to trek back down the hillside toward the part of the creek that she knew he favored for fishing. Her mind worked to think of something clever to say to take away the sting she'd given his sense of pride by calling him a boy. She was so preoccupied with this, she didn't hear the horses and their riders approach until they were upon her. At a glance, she guessed there to be at least a few dozen men in the unsavory-looking group. Most of them rode on, but half a dozen stayed behind. They circled her with their horses, moving quickly to and fro to prevent her from escaping, while they laughed and chattered about wanting her to be friendly. She wasn't sure why she was so frightened about the concept of being friendly to them. She was congenial to everyone who came through the settlement. It was a necessary type of retail politics. Not only was there something about the way they said the word that gave her the impression that their idea of friendly and hers wasn't the same, but their filthy, ragtag appearance revulsed her with every step their horses took to close her into a tighter circle. Most who came to the trading post were trappers, miners, and loggers. They were hard-working men who were often in need of hygiene lessons. but they were well-mannered and respectful for the most part. These characters were not only smelly and filthy, but they were bold and uncouth in their mannerism toward her. When one of them leapt off his horse and tossed her to the ground, she quickly learned what they meant by being friendly. Although still untouched, she'd seen it done often enough with the livestock to understand what was happening. Breath that stunk of unbrushed, rotted teeth and chewing tobacco turned her stomach as she forced his kisses upon her lips and person. The sound of tearing fabric echoed off the hillside while icy cold air assaulted her firm breasts. The snow beneath her stung her exposed flesh. She suffered pain both inside and out, as each man took his turn with her, some more than once. They not only enjoyed forcing their peckers into every orifice she possessed, as hard and fast as they could, but they accompanied their sexual assaults with blows from their fists, and deep, vicious bites from their filthy, rotted teeth. By the time their lust and need for violence was satiated, she lay naked, bloody, bruised, and barely conscious on the unforgiving hillside. The last thing she recalled before the world went black was the sound of their laughter and crude comments about what they had done to her and the overwhelming smell of smoke coming from the settlement. Chapter 1. Early Summer, 1899. The settlement of Muddy Creek had long been destroyed, but that didn't stop Ian from traveling there to inspect his newly acquired property. It was part of the parcel he had recently purchased. The Union Pacific purchased it on speculation that the railroad would go through. When a more forgiving and favorable terrain was acquired, this land was considered good for very little, and thus sold to Ian for a very appealing price. It may not have looked like it was worth much to the railroad, but to Ian Murray it had the makings of a good and solid sheep domain to add to his already established cattle ranch. The remains of the burned and abandoned settlement were positioned on the far west of his newly acquired 1,000 acres. More mountainous and hilly than his 5,000-acre cattle ranch, it was the reason he intended to raise sheep on it. For a cattle rancher to pair his stock with sheep was unheard of in these parts, and sure to cause a stir. He just hoped that stir wouldn't be initiated by fear and ignorance from his neighbors. He had worked hard over the years to build himself up to the level of comfort and prosperity that he now enjoyed. After almost a decade of dealing with outlaws, rogue miners, and battles between the local warring Indian tribes, things had finally settled down. He wanted to keep it that way. His ranch hand, Jackson Campbell, rode toward him while pointing to a house that looked to be still intact. "It looks like you might be able to turn this one into the sheep herder's cabin, boss. It's got a little singe to it, but for the most part, it avoided the destruction most of them suffered." Ian looked at the house in reference. Its weathered exterior sported slightly charred patches that were often left on the exterior of buildings that were near the heart of a neighborhood fire. But the roof looked good and the walls were straight. From what he could tell, the building was large enough to have at least 2 rooms, possibly 3. Traces of his Irish brogue sounded in his voice when he asked, "Have you been inside?" Jackson hopped off his horse and took the reins to carefully lead it down the debris-ridden street. "I was just going to do that. This place had the makings of a fine mountain town. We could have used one of them in these parts. There's a building that looks like they even had a trading post. It's a damn shame what that Jones gang did to these parts. It's good they're all hanged," Ian said as he hopped off his horse and mimicked Jackson. He kicked at some pieces of wood and the remnants of a clay pot. "This will all have to be cleaned up. I can't risk the sheep coming down and mulling around through it." "Are you sure you want to raise sheep, boss? I heard that old man Simpson is bitching up a storm about it. You won't win any popularity prizes from the other ranchers." "Other than logging, there's not much else I can do with this piece of property. It's too mountainous for cattle. Besides, wool is a good commodity to be involved in. Simpson and the like will just have to get over it. Once they see the convenience of having wool for their women so handy, they'll come around. A good bowl of mutton stew once in a while might be a nice change for them as well," Jackson said with a grin. "Aye, that it might. Do you think you might reopen the trading post?" Ian scratched his weathered chin. "I'll have to think on that. I'm not sure I want to encourage travelers to traipse across my property. It's a recipe for trouble most of the time."